Welcome to another exciting installment of NJIT TAB Talks. I'm Mimi Marcus, Manager of Marketing and Engagement for NJIT TAB, housed under the Center for Community Systems under Hillier College of Architecture and Design here at NJIT. I'm your host for today's session. We are thrilled to have you here. For anybody new to the TAB Talks series, our premise or purpose for this series is to spotlight timely, practical topics in brownfield redevelopment, specifically around community revitalization, economic development, equitable development, and site reuse. Our goal is to bring together subject matter experts to demystify challenges, share tools, case studies, lessons learned. So with that in mind, today we're diving into a topic that is foundational to transforming distressed properties and fostering vibrant communities, the power of land banks. So this conversation promises to provide essential knowledge, actionable insights for anyone working to reclaim or revitalize communities. But it is my distinct pleasure to introduce our incredible speakers today. We're honored to have with us two leading experts from the National Land Bank Network at the Center for Community Progress, an organization that NJIT TAB proudly partners with to lend brownfield expertise to their team and the communities they support. We're glad to share some of the resources we developed together, as well as highlight a particularly exciting opportunity that we're teaming up on, but more on that later. First, to slightly embarrass my humble panelists, allow me to introduce Brian Larkin. He's the director of the National Land Bank Network at the Center for Community Progress, the first membership-based community of practice for the land banking field. He connects land bank leaders to essential tools, networks, and resources they need to return those vacant properties to productive use. And Brian's career began as a neighborhood planner, fostering his enduring commitment to equitable revitalization. And you'll see why he is a sought-after trainer and public speaker that inspires meaningful change across the country. His right hand in this is Christina Carter-Grant. She's the Associate Director of the National Land Bank Network at the Center for Community Progress. A true convener with community-centered mindset, Christina drives the network's mission to provide land bank leaders with the knowledge, relationships, and resources to tackle vacancy and abandonment. Her work includes highlighting case studies of brownfield redevelopment and providing guidance for residents addressing problem properties. So the true sign of community builders is the discomfort they might have when others attempt to articulate their invaluable contributions. But Brian, Christina, thank you both for being here. Really looking forward to this talk.
Thank you, Mimi. Appreciate the introductions.
And I have to say, it is always great to have a talk with two planners. It is smooth sailing for the most part. Yeah, our first question, though, I'll kick it off to you, Brian. Let's start with the basics for those in our audience. It looks like we have some veterans and some folks raising their hand, but again, please use the chat feature or the Q&A, and we'll incorporate your comments in the discussion. For those that might be new to the concept, though, can you explain exactly what a land bank is, why they exist? And
Absolutely, Mimi. Thanks for that question. And I'm keeping an eye on the chat over here. So if you see me glance to the right, seeing some of the folks who are in the audience today, please keep bringing that information in about who you are and where you're at, because I see we have some true experts of landfills in the audience here, of land banks in the audience here, who can probably provide much more information even than I could. Some folks for the land bank at Albany, New York. I see folks there and some other land banks across the country. But thank you again for allowing us to be a part of this space. You guys have done such great work in carrying the message out about the technical tools that are necessary for communities to really revitalize some of the toughest properties there could be when you're talking about the work related to brownfields. And I think land banks can be a vital tool, and to date are probably an underutilized tool in some communities. So a land bank is, for all intents and purposes, a public authority that's created to receive problem properties. Now, what that looks like varies across the country. You could have different legislation, typically at the state level. You have legislation that provides you specific tools and directions on what a land bank is in your community. A land bank can be land banks are created with a series of key powers, and I'll just list off kind of the comprehensive suite. What I'm going to explain right now isn't one particular land bank, but it's just kind of all of what exists there. But land banks are created to acquire property, acquire tax foreclosed property cost effectively, to dispose of that property or transfer it to another place flexibly, and to hold that property tax free. And so those are kind of the main tools that land banks bring to your communities. And so what I'll talk a little bit about is kind of what does that mean? And so when we talk about acquiring property cost effectively, we're thinking about this pipeline right here. Where do these problem properties come from? When you think about our communities, you see a property. It could be a residential property. It could be a commercial property. It could be an industrial property we're talking about. But if that property is not being maintained and the owner of the property is not willing to invest the resources to make it a viable part of the community, when land banks are created and when there is the appropriate mechanisms in place, they can get these properties. They can identify with their communities and say, hey, this property that is not being cared for, that they're not paying their taxes on in the pieces, let's go through a foreclosure process so that then we can acquire it. When the land bank acquires the property in certain states, they have ways to acquire this cheaper than other places. And there's various mechanisms and ways you get to that. States are looking to adjust some of their rules now based on national changes. But by and large, land banks are created with laws to get tax foreclosed property cheaper than other places and then hold it tax exempt. And so when they have that property, a lot of the challenges that are on these problem properties before are legal challenges. There's like, are there liens? Are there tax liens? Are there code liens? Are there issues with the title, previous owners, heirs issues? Are there any issues with the quality of the structure? Are there any issues with what's below ground? Land banks are able to, by process of whatever abilities they're given in the law, keep that property free and clear so that it's ready to transfer to a new owner without having to deal with any of those legal challenges. And then also in many communities, land banks have leveraged their role as a large property owner to go and attract resources, EPA resources for phase 1 environmentals, phase 2, the things that are necessary for properties to be ready to be productive, to be returned to productive reuse. And so that's what it's like. That's what their acquisition process is like. That's what it's like when they maintain the property. And then when they transfer the property, one thing that's really unique and why you have land banks, in many communities, municipalities have certain disposition requirements that they have to adhere to. For instance, in some cases, you may have to put out an RFP or put it out to bid for a certain amount of time and transfer the property to the highest return. When you think about how municipalities are functioning, they're using tax dollars, and those tax dollars belong to you and I, and we expect that they'll get the best return for the investment on our dollars. When we're dealing with problem properties and we're dealing with systemic problems and systemic vacancy, it's not always in the best interest of the community to take that problem property, to stabilize it, and then turn it to whoever can pay the highest dollar. Sometimes the best productive use may be something more aligned with local goals and local priorities, where they may not be able to match the dollar amount of maybe an out-of-state investor, but their long-term goals of planning to turn this into productive reuse as open space, as a new development, as housing, as commercial, as residential, industrial, vacant space, whatever those activities are, they may more closely align with a healthy and vibrant community that can then break that cycle. And so a land bank is created so they can understand the community's goals and do their dispositions in ways that are aligned by that, not aligned by necessarily highest dollar and highest return. And so that, by and large, is what a land bank is and where their properties come from.
Thanks. That's a great overview. And you brought up a lot of points that I'm sure, and I hope our attendees pull the threads on in terms of really thoughtful redevelopment. I'm sure just by kind of touting the benefits that you mentioned and the flexibility that's there, how are land banks actually created? And from your experience, how does a community determine if forming a land bank is the right strategic step for them?
That is a very, very important question. And looking back at the chat, I see a lot of communities that may not have land banks yet. And you may be on this call because you're thinking, you know what, I think I want a land bank, or at least I think I want to know if this works for us. So the conditions in which land banks work most effectively are conditions where you have, number one, a series of problem properties. We use the acronym VAD, V-A-D, vacant, abandoned, and deteriorated, VAD. So if you have an amount of VAD properties, that is a problem. So we recognize that in any housing market, real estate market, healthy or various levels, there is an appropriate level of vacancy. Vacancy happens, it's a normal part of that. But when you get to levels where you're going through communities and you can point to general areas that are becoming more and more vacant, and there's becoming abandonment and there's deterioration, you have a systematic problem there. So if you have a large amount of VAD or problem properties, two, if the ownership is not consolidated, so if you have fragmented ownership of these problem properties, and then three, if these properties could reliably be connected or be transferred to a new entity. And so what do I mean by that? If a private owner owns their problem property and they're paying their taxes, that problem property is probably not regularly going to be immediately transferred to that land bank. And so you may be wanting to look at some other things when you're in those places. But when you have VAD properties that are tax delinquent, that is a prime scenario for a land bank to come in and receive those properties in a way more cost effectively than other places. Also, what would be important if you're thinking about your community, and so thinking about it from the perspective of if you're driving around your community, or if you're looking at a map of your community and you can point to a specific area that, yep, that's where problem properties are. The next step would be looking at, all right, what does tax delinquency looks like? Oftentimes, if you can overlay those things, there's usually some mapping up of that. That is the piece there. And then the last piece is looking at your municipality. So your wherever your taxes are collected, at most communities at the county level, but if it's at the county level, the municipal level, or regional level, that form of government, seeing where that interest is in connecting with another entity to really help deal with these problems. And so those are the communities in which land banks can have the greatest impact and do the most benefit for addressing their problems. And I know we have another slide. I don't know if we have access though to click forward. Yes. And so when we're talking about that, these are the places across the country that have looked at the conditions that I just laid out and said, you know what, land banking makes sense for us. What we notice here, a lot of places that went through steep population decline, a lot of places that had large amount of industrial manufacturing that declined over generations. What do those two things usually align up with also? Areas with a lot of brownfields. So we've seen a lot of overlap between areas that can benefit from the tools that land banks bring and areas that are looking to wrap their arms around challenges with returning brownfield properties to productive uses of their community.
I think you answered a couple folks that chimed in asking if we were aware of regional land banks, if multiple counties can participate in one land bank. Kind of veering off a little bit, but are there considerations that folks should make when they're forming a land bank in terms of the boundaries within a land bank?
Yes, and I'm sorry, and I was walking through kind of the conditions, but I did. So I walked through the conditions and I didn't answer your original question of like, how do you create the land bank? So I stated the conditions in which this makes sense for a land bank, but then the process, when you look at these states that are outlined here, I would say on our website at the Center for Community Progress, if you navigate to where our map is, it'll show you the states that have what we call a comprehensive enabling legislation. So you pass a state law that says, this is what it takes to create a land bank. That state law tells you kind of the jurisdictions in which land banks can cover. So in some instances, like the state of Michigan, the land banks in the state of Michigan are, based on their enabling legislation, created at the county level, unless there's going to be a specific exception. The reason for that, if you think about kind of what I've talked about this far, the county level is where the taxes are collected. And so you want that direct connection of, this is where your property is coming from, and this is the area that you can serve. Let's make it as seamless as possible, that all the property that you're able to receive through your special pipelining tools are aligned with one area, and they're the ones authorizing, they're allowing it the creation. So when people who are on the call are interested in this, first, look and see if your state has enabling legislation. If you're in a state that does have enabling legislation, that will explain and lay out very explicitly who can create the land bank. Does it need to be a county or a municipality? Can it be a partnership? If we want to do one at the regional level, what does that take? Who needs to sign on for the creation of that? And then what powers does that land bank have once created? In some communities, the legislation is as explicit to lay out kind of board makeup and kind of all of those pieces, but it really will lay that out in detail. If you are not in a state that has what we consider comprehensive enabling legislation, then figuring out where the problems exist for problem properties, and if this is something at a statewide level, what it would look like for a coalition to get together to kind of create those sorts of laws that allow for a land bank to be really impactful. We at the Center for Community Progress really believe in having some comprehensive enabling legislation, because that is where you get your power. That is where you're able to really address the challenges that we laid out at the beginning. And one thing we want to make very clear, while we are the foremost leaders in land banking activity, we run the National Land Bank Network, we're by no means saying every single place needs to have a land bank and do whatever you can to create one. We're saying when a land bank is an appropriate tool, let's go through these steps so you have a powerful and impactful land bank. Because absent a lot of these steps, absent the legislation, absent the specific powers created in there, absent the authority, some communities may create a land bank and then feel frustrated that they're not able to do the goals that they set out to do in the first place. And that's the worst case scenario for us. We want every community that has a land bank to really utilize it towards its best benefit, and for the community, and most importantly, the residents, to see the benefit of having one.
Yeah, that's powerful. It also kind of leads to what Christina had mentioned in our pre-session about the fact that the Center for Community Progress has a lot of planners and lawyers on there. It sounds like that is a 1-2 combo to really support communities through navigating not only how to form the land bank, but if it makes sense to do so, as well as the steps. So thank you. Like, understanding the how to even create this is crucial. But let's dive into talking about the properties themselves. Like, where do land banks typically acquire their properties from? You touched on that a little bit, especially as you were mentioning the tax records, which seems like a really clear path forward. Are there other common pipelines for land banks to like take control of vacant or problem sites?
Yes, there are. And so if you look at on the slide here at the bottom of the right side, other sources of inventory. So outside of the tax foreclosure pipeline, land banks get their properties from donation, private purchase, property swaps, government transfers, in those various ways. I will say when land banks were started, when the emergence of land banks really expanded rapidly over the country, around 2008 to the present day, at the very beginning, the overwhelming majority of property came through this pipeline that you see right here. So this pipeline that's explained right here is mapping out how properties get into a land bank through the tax foreclosure pipeline. I would say the overwhelming majority of properties came this way. We're talking 80, 85, 90% of properties that land banks have. Also at the National Land Bank Network, we do a survey every other year. So we're tracking kind of where properties are coming from. Just 4 years ago, almost 80% of property came through this traditional pipeline that you see across the front screen right there. To date now, it's just a little bit over half. So that number is starting to decrease that percentage is starting to decrease, which means land banks are looking at other areas as well as ways to receive property, especially for established land banks that are providing a lot of capacity to their larger community, whether that's dealing with federal grants, whether that's convening neighborhood groups, whether that's urban planning knowledge and all of those other pieces. When they're leveraging those tools in addition to their traditional land banking tools, they're oftentimes looking at different ways to acquire property.
I'd hope that, the TAB providers are also supporting those individual communities that have brownfields that don't quite consist enough to support a land bank. But that's another area that my team can also share on in terms of the inventories that you were talking about, in terms of like locating where those problem properties might be. And it's interesting in our different domains how we kind of speak about the properties. Like you mentioned, VAD. And I think there's also a blog post on the Center for Community Progress about the term blighted. So definitely interested in the audience here sharing their inputs and thoughts on that. But yeah, you gave us a great, clear picture of the operational foundation for land banks. From your perspective, if you could dive in a little bit more, and you kind of touched on it, why are land banks uniquely positioned to effectively address brownfields, even beyond what like traditional remediation programs might achieve by themselves?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the core of what land banks were here to deal with, they're here to deal with the properties that the private market doesn't know what to do with and is walking away from. What better description is there for brownfields? They're huge albatrosses across communities' necks sometimes. And it takes an institution that has experience with dealing with vacancy, dealing with, in addition to large scale brownfields, we often have in the urban centers, you have environmental remediation efforts that are needed on small parcels like dry cleaners, gas stations, pieces that in some places are of the scale of a brownfield, but land banks have the ability to kind of work with all of these different pieces and their abilities to assemble property when you're thinking about what happens next, right? So you receive the brownfield, but it may need to go through the process of planning and zoning, and we're going to rezone the area, or we're splitting up parcels, or bringing in additional parcels to make a new different type of district. When you're looking at a kind of future, land banks are specifically there in places where what was happening before has come to a stop. The normal function of a neighborhood, of a community that's going, has come to a stop, and a new future needs to really be figured out on how we're going to, and the new future may be revitalizing existence, but land banks are there at that intersection, at that space there. When you've seen industry change drastically and leave, these parcels represent a great opportunity, but the first step is connecting with the necessary resources, working with the state, working with the federal government, and then connecting with the local partners who are going to do the work, environmental companies and those pieces. Land banks are doing this work already. All the different components of working with property and working with the individual partners in spaces. So they make amazing resources to shepherd a process, but then they also make great places and great sources to hold the property in the amount of time it takes to work on some of these. In some communities that I'm sure are represented on the call today, holding that property, depending on what type of organization you are, can be very expensive. They're holding costs when dealing with that. Land banks are able to hold property tax exempt, and as a result can work as a partner in kind of engaging with that. And also, as their status as a public agency, are able to retrieve some of the necessary funds when we're looking at the different phases of investigation and cleanup, and then are able to market and promote on a community-wide scale. So a brownfield exists within a larger community. That larger community oftentimes has property and strategies and plans that the land bank is already engaged in. And so when you're looking at the redevelopment efforts, the future of it, the vitality of that, instead of having to go forward on this property being reimagined by itself, this brownfield property is now a part of a larger core, and oftentimes it's the catalyst, it's one of the largest pieces or the most troubling pieces, but now is part of a larger piece where we could say there's going to be a revitalization of the brownfield. There's also going to be some single family housing work. There's going to be some small neighborhood commercial corridor. Land banks are working in all of those spaces together and can really think forwardly in how to bring those pieces together.
It's really powerful point about the unique capabilities. It almost touches on Leah's question in the chat or in the Q&A, but we'll circle back to that. Christina, I wanted to bring you in here, especially with your deep expertise in like tackling the vacancies and brownfield adjacent. To bring it to life to our audience, can you share like what are some of the best or most inspiring examples you've seen of land banks that successfully engage in brownfield development? Any specific like case studies that really highlight their impact?
Absolutely. And I can think of a few just from our work that we were able to complete last year. So with support from EPA grant, Community Progress was able to conduct interviews as well as site visits with land banks that we considered leaders in the brownfield redevelopment space. And from those site visits, we were able to produce a case studies publication that we just released earlier this year, and it highlighted brownfield redevelopment projects from 3 land banks. So Genesee County Land Bank Authority, Houston Land Bank, and the West Virginia Land Stewardship Corporation. And so a project that comes to mind for me comes out of Genesee County Land Bank, also known as GCLBA. And I'd like to give a little bit of a brief background about the land bank itself and before diving into the project details. So Genesee County Land Bank is located in Flint, Michigan. Many of us are familiar with Flint, but for those that are not, Flint is about an hour outside of Detroit. Flint, once upon a time, had a booming auto industry, right? But once the city started to see some of the plants close and subsequently population loss, the city started to experience vacancy, abandonment, and deterioration, as Brian previously mentioned, that. So Genesee County Land Bank has been very instrumental in tackling vacancy in the city. I mean, they're one of the larger land banks, have about 31 full-time staffers, 14,000 properties in their inventory, and many of those properties are brownfields. So as you see on the screen, this was an oil change facility that also doubled as a car wash and auto repair shop at one point. But once it ceased operations, the site itself was contaminated with petroleum. So GCLBA, again, Genesee County Land Bank, they were able to acquire the property in 2011, and they did a EPA emergency response to some of the oil drums that were on site at the property. They then moved to completing phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessments. And then they also leveraged funds from the Michigan Blight Elimination Program to do some demolition and site cleanup. And the site was development ready by 2015. So what I love in particular about this project, and Brian kind of touched on this earlier in some of the his talking points, they didn't just clean up the site and say, hey, we're selling it to the highest bidder. They actually held the property for about 8 years, and they wanted it to be wanted the property to go towards a project that would benefit the public good. So this turned out to be a great decision because by 2019, with the Greater Flint Mental Health facilities and the Genesee Health System, they acquired the site for what would become the Center for Children's Integrated Services. So as you can see on the screen, this is a beautiful 60,000 square foot state-of-the-art facility. It has physical and mental health care services, specifically for the children in Flint, but also in surrounding communities. And best of all, it's located next to a major highway, so it makes care accessible to people that are in the area. So for me, this project was a really beautiful project and a thoughtful project, and it is also a perfect illustration of brownfield redevelopment work like the intersection of brownfield redevelopment work and addressing a public health need.
That's incredible. Beautiful result for sure. And impressive that they held on to it for 8 years to make sure this happened. I'm sure there was a lot of legwork during that time.
Yeah, yeah.
And I'm really glad that Miles Balog is on too. He's one of our collaborators from NSAFE that is really a real champion of what has been dubbed health fields, the placement for healthcare or healthcare serving reuse of brownfields. So this sounds like a fantastic example. It does bring up a question that he had, kind of pivoting a little bit off. Can you develop like a special purpose land bank, countywide, statewide, or nationally? It sounds like land banks can serve multiple purposes, but is there any avenue of like special interest or special purposes?
Go ahead,
So
Brian.
I'll get that one. Depends on where you're located, first and foremost. So in the example of Michigan, land banks are the short answer is depends on your legislation. The enabling legislation tells you where it can be at and how that functions. In Michigan, where Genesee County is located, land banks are created at the county level. And if you are in a county that has not created a land bank, there is a statewide land bank that exists that can serve the efforts of receiving that pipeline of property. But individuals wouldn't go and create the land bank. The land bank, based on the rules, it says, okay, well, who authorizes the land bank? The tax collecting authority. In some places, it's the school district or other paid, like the places who are receiving taxes. Because think about what the land bank is really saying. It's the individuals who are collecting taxes who are agreeing, hey, we're not going to collect taxes when you receive that because you're going to put extra work into it so we can turn our raw soil change into a beautiful facility like this. So the individuals who are signing off of to give you the powers are the ones that are creating it. It's typically not like a small organization or a grassroots group that then becomes like a land bank for a specific geography, like a neighbor, like, you know how you can have a business improvement district or an easy and economic
Development authority or something.
Yeah. So it's not like that. It's more of a public agent. Think of a quasi-public or public authority that's created by government. Government has the authority to create, and then it stands alone and exists and functions in those spaces. And so the geography you can exist at is based on the legislation. We have land banks that exist at the municipal level. We have land banks that exist at the county level. We have land banks that exist at regional level, where it's multiple counties together. And then we have statewide land banks. So those are the 4 geographies that exist across the country. And it all depends on what your state legislation allows.
Good reason to get active for sure. And this example is really inspiring and just a beautiful result, very like dynamic to look at. And people often think of brownfield redevelopment. They envision like large, complex projects taking 8 years to complete. But is that always the case? Are there brownfield redevelopment projects that may not involve as much capital or time, focus on smaller, more impactful sites?
Yeah, there are, and one of my favorite examples comes out of Marquette County, Michigan. So I'm just going to kind of skip a little bit ahead to kind of share with the audience. So Marquette, a few years ago, they acquired from a private party 2 properties that were brownfield properties. One happened to be a house that was contaminated by lead and asbestos, as you see on the screen. And that house was adjacent to a vacant lot that used to also house a auto repair shop. So once they acquired the property, one of the cool aspects of this project was that they partnered with a local high school to do construction on the house, and they had the high schoolers be able to use their geometry and construction class to get a hands-on experience in applying geometry principles to the construction project. but they also had a opportunity to contribute to something that was creating a new community asset. So the project itself was about, let's say, 116,000, with the land bank, Marquette County Land Bank, coming out of pocket about 36,000 for those costs. But they were able to turn the properties into this beautiful home that obviously was sold to a family. So again, it's just another example of, like, yeah, you don't have to always have these multi-million years long projects. You can have a project that may not take as much time or require much as investment, but still have an impact on the community.
That's incredible. And to actually have hands-on learning, that's
Yeah,
a win
yeah.
on so many levels. And I know I kind of jumped around, but are there other ways that you've seen land banks address brownfields that might not be tied to property remediation or redevelopment? I'll circle back on that because
Sure, sure. So, yes, and that comes from our folks out of the Houston Land Bank. And we have dubbed the Houston Land Bank the People Powered Land Bank because they personify this in the work that they do. I'm on the screen. You have a photo from their Juice and Justice Breakfast, which is a quarterly meeting that they host, and they bring together community stakeholders to discuss solutions to environmental justice in Houston. So one of my favorite quotes in the Land Banks and Brownfields publication that I mentioned earlier actually comes from the executive director of the Houston Land Bank and also our Community Progress Board member, Chris Stoneham. And it says, "Together we are creating a city where every resident has the opportunity to thrive, where no one is left behind, and where the legacy of neglect is transformed into one of empowerment." And this quote is illustrated in the case study that came out of the Greater Fifth Ward neighborhood in Houston. And it's really a heartbreaking story to unpack. I mean, you have this community that's located next to a former rail yard, and the rail yard was in operation from about 1899 to about 1984. And when the rail yard ceased operations, the site itself was contaminated with a chemical known as creosote. And I apologize if I'm pronouncing things wrong. I'm not always the best. But that particular chemical was used to treat wood. However, it's also a known carcinogen. So back in 2019, a cancer cluster analysis was conducted, and it was found that just by sheer proximity of the Fifth Ward neighborhood being next to that former rail yard, that community saw spikes in cancer and also other adverse health effects. So in 2024, the Houston City Council stepped in and they approved $2 million to go towards the constructions of new homes on Houston Land Bank vacant lots. And what's nice about this project is that the Houston Land Bank gets to oversee construction. So they're not just building homes, they're also replicating some of the features of the residents' current homes, just to kind of help ease that transition into new housing and out of their, former neighborhood. And I love this example because it shows like a different type of remediation project, right? While the land bank wasn't necessarily involved in the cleanup work, they still played a key role. They developed like trust amongst the residents. They developed trust amongst city leadership, to get the funding to lead the project. And they're helping to relocate residents from a contaminated area to a safer, healthier environment. So for me, it's a great reminder that land banks can support environmental justice efforts and public health outcomes without leading the cleanup work themselves.
and just have demonstrable impact in a community. That's incredible.
Exactly.
Yeah, I was going to say, Krista had presented in one of our colleagues' webinar series, Roots to Resilience from Sea Clear and Groundworks USA. And she had shared some other inspiring projects that they're taking on. A former Velasco incinerator site comes to mind. They're utilizing $5 million in EPA grant funding to take an abandoned trash incinerator site and turn it into green space similar kind of thoughtfulness in having community amenities put forward with it. But it's just really interesting to have land banks serve as continuation, sort of the continuity within a community to provide that sort of communication on a regular basis. The event that you're speaking to, one of our colleagues from the NJIT team was able to join that, and he just remarked on just how great it was to be in a space where you have so many passionate voices, but they're with the history of the land that they're speaking of, of the community. They're talking about their own neighborhood, and who knows it better than somebody who's lived there their whole life.
Exactly. And I was actually on that site visit with your colleague, so we were able to go to the space. And yeah, I mean, even like, again, as you see in the photo, they not only engage in brownfield redevelopment work, but they make sure that the community has a seat at the table, that they are looped into the work that they are doing. And it's just amazing to just see them in action.
Yeah, it's not an easy feat to get that many collective voices to the table, but when it happens, like magical things come out of it. So really excited to hear about more of these projects.
And Mimi, can I chime in?
Yeah, please.
And that's that example right there is not just a coincidence. So as land banks were created, recognize that there was a problem in that the way problem properties were existing and communities were existing is that the only solution was, okay, well, a property gets sold at auction, somebody far away thinks they can make money off of it. And the land banks came in and say, we've got to disrupt this model and we've got to amplify local community voice, because the only way we're really going to see vibrancy is if the people who are invested in being here, who want to be here, are able to have a say in what happens next. And so then when you see results like this, when land banks are able to come into those, they're able to bring their core skills and their core tools to really bring any type of project to fruition, but especially when dealing with brownfields.
Much more eloquently said. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's incredible. Hopefully we're getting folks excited about land banks and the impact that they can have on communities. But what's some of the advice, and I've definitely been taking it in for as many of the land bank presentations I've been able to join, but what's some advice you've heard from the various land banks already involved in brownfield redevelopment that you'd want to share with all the other land banks and folks looking to engage in brownfield remediation efforts?
And I'm just going to leave Houston Land Bank up on the screen because this actually came from our folks at the Houston Land Bank, the interviews that we did in the beginning. And that was just do it because you're probably already doing the work. I believe the last number from EPA is that there are about 450,000 properties in the US, brownfield properties, that is. And many of those properties may already be in your inventory if you're a land bank. There's often a hesitation to do brownfield remediation work just because of things like maybe a lack of resources like funding or concerns about liability. And we recognize that. And we also recognize that it can be costly. We know that it's not necessarily overnight work, but it is possible. There are resources that can help. There are land banks that are already doing the work that are willing to lend advice. And also Community Progress and the National Land Bank Network, we're here to serve as a resource for those that are looking to engage in the work as well. So if you're not doing it, just know that you can do it.
And a lot of folks on the call are hopefully engaging with your team and ours to push those efforts forward. I think that kind of gives a nice segue to another opportunity that we're teaming up on, but being led by the Center for Community Progress. I kind of teased about it a little bit in the beginning of our conversation, but Christina, I don't know if you wanted to share a little bit more about the Land Banks and Brownfields Technical Assistance Scholarship.
Yeah. So just this week, we announced that we are offering free technical assistance services for up to 5 communities. And the purpose of this scholarship is to increase the number of land banks that are engaged in brownfield remediation work. So as shown on the screen, in order to be eligible to apply, you must be a community that is looking to do one of the following: either craft and pass state enabling legislation to address brownfield properties. You want to create a new land bank to help address brownfield properties in a state with enabling legislation, or, emphasis on or, help an existing land bank engage in brownfield assessment, remediation, and or reuse. So the deadline to apply is September 19th at 5 p.m. We will drop the link in the chat, as well as contact information for my colleague, Nora Daly, who I don't think she's on the call, but she's happy to answer any additional questions people may have about the scholarship. So really encourage you to apply. We're offering it up to 5 communities, and we like to support you in your revitalization efforts.
I'm hoping folks take us up on it, utilize all the support that's out there. As you mentioned and illustrated, there's some projects that are smaller scale, but a lot of these are the larger lifts that we're trying to encourage communities to take advantage of the EPA funding brownfield, the EPA brownfield grants that are available. There's the job training grant for brownfields is actually out now, but we anticipate the next notice of funding for the larger MARC grants to open up in September. And we'll talk a little bit more about another session where Christina, you, Kaylin, and Nora will be speaking more about that intersection, how to take advantage of the grant funding that's available. Generally, it is a struggle to put together the capital, put together that coalition that really drives these projects to completion. So yeah, I mean, if you guys are good, we can open it up to the Q&A. Thanks everyone for chiming in already. Please keep on adding in your questions, but we'll dive in with Erica Hall's question. How can land banks and land trusts intersect?
So I'll take a stab at that. And Erica, if you're still on, if you could add in the chat explicitly which type of land trust you're talking about, because I'll talk about a couple of them. So there's conservation land trusts in areas, and then there's community land trusts. I'm going to assume you're talking about community land trusts, which are created for the creation of affordable housing. So if you're not, then let me know in the chat. And also, we have a publication on land banks and land trusts that I will look for when I'm done talking, and then try to put there as well. But a community land trust, a CLT, is created around a model that looks at keeping permanent affordability in a community where there is some sort of mechanism in place that the trust controls the ability for the price of that home to grow too much. So the first person buys it, and then when they're ready to sell, the land trust has a control on how much it can grow, so that you'll know for generations to come, this neighborhood or community will always have some sort of affordable housing. So for that next family looking for their starter home, community land trusts work most often. Not often. Their tools are most effective in areas with really rapidly increasing prices, home prices. And since 2020, we've seen across the country, even in our weakest real estate markets, that prices are increasing. Land banks are most effective in areas with problem properties. Remember, we're talking about your tax abandonment, tax delinquent properties that are going through tax foreclosure that people are abandoning. They work best together when there's an understanding of kind of the geographies that CLTs want to go, and land banks are able to use their long, patient tools, similar to the example we saw in Genesee County, in obtaining property, whether it's through their traditional means or other places, holding property, tax exempt, and then transferring it to the CLT for that purpose. One of the biggest challenges for CLTs are the property acquisition costs for areas they want to work in. And so CLTs and land banks work together when there is an agreement put in place, and they can help lower the cost for acquiring properties, acquiring land, or actually structures in the areas CLTs are interested in. One of the big challenges, though, I would say, is that oftentimes when you recognize that a CLT would be a great tool that's needed for your community, at that point, it can often be too late for a land bank to get the sort of inventory you're interested in. Because land banks are working in those areas that the private market said, we can't make any money here. And COTs are working in the areas where the private market is trying to make too much money and people can't live there. So they're working at opposite ends, but in a lot of cases, if you're intentional about your strategies, your long-term directions and where you're headed, they can serve as a great pipeline for property to transition over to CLTs. And that in our publication that Christina put in the chat there, we highlight a few communities that have done some great work there. One that comes to mind is out of Columbus, Ohio, where the actual organizations are one entity. They are housed in one entity. So the CLT and the land bank are housed in one place. And Erica, I'll assume I answered the right piece of land trust, because there's a whole other piece on conservation, but I don't think that's what she was asking. But if you are, let us know either in the chat or the Q&A, and I'll come back and answer that also.
Yeah, that sounds incredible to have both ends of the spectrum working in the same house, if you will. A great tact, and probably also just such a dichotomy of going into into work and then having to try and facilitate some properties that you just can't get off the ground. Which isn't a question in the chat, but one that I wanted to bring up, since Martha at the Newark Land Bank and Gregory Good had brought up in a session I attended at the New Jersey Futures and New Jersey Chapter APA conference that just happened. We talked about it a little bit, but I wanted to make sure the audience was aware of like different tools that or tactics that land banks have employed. I really liked the discussion they had around the side lot initiative. And it's one of those smaller scale projects or resources that land banks provide to their communities, but I think it has such impact. I don't know if Brian and Christina, you could speak a little bit more to that.
Yeah, I can talk about it. Side lots, when you think of property that a land bank has, oftentimes it's been abandoned. And the first thing we want to do is figure out, how can we return this to productive use? Who is most likely to care about a property and care for a property are the people in the neighborhood. And who has the most proximity to that? The direct neighbors, the people whose property abuts next to that. And so with many of the vacant lots that land, and another note on our survey, we identified that the majority of the inventory of land banks are structure-free lots. Almost 90% of the parcels that are in land banks across the country have no structures on them. So we're talking about vacant lots. And if you're looking at vacant lots in the middle of a community that's right next to a homeowner, that homeowner is going to care a lot more than anyone else in what happens there. And so in order to put it in the property in the hands of responsible homeowners, land banks across the country develop side lot programs, where for a very affordable amount, they're able to transfer this property over to the homeowner, who then can use it to expand their lot, to fence in, to do different work, to expand their property area, or to just care for it. That has seen a huge uptick, and oftentimes those properties were in places that were not probably ideal for redeveloping or building up a new home on in spaces. I will say, as the market has changed, and a lot of those side lot programs have moved through very quickly, there are much less inventory available for side lots now. And actually now some communities are really interested in doing infill development projects of how can we bring more housing, because with the COT conversation and other places, the need for housing is there. So some of the prime places that can rebuild the teeth of a comb of a community are now looking for development opportunities and partnering with COTs and CDCs.
Great segue into a question from Leah around housing. Are there land banks that place restrictions on who can purchase, for example, residents only, low, moderate income buyers only, as a way to help support providing affordable housing or affordable land to build on? And I think Martha had spoken to that a little bit for Newark, but with your wider national lens, have you seen different land banks tackle that?
The short answer is yes. And so, and when I mentioned on the front end that the reason the special power that a land bank has that your municipality doesn't have, flexible disposition. And all that means is exactly what you're putting right here. It's saying we can determine who we're going to sell it to or transfer to, and what they need to do as a responsibility of that. If I'm going to give a vacant lot to a local resident to do a community garden instead of selling it to a real estate investment trust for 10 times that amount, then I at least need the community garden to happen, right? And the same is for affordable housing and other pieces. Christina mentioned, and you guys mentioned, we have a lot of legal expertise at the Center for Community Progress. Unfortunately for you all today, you don't have any of that legal expertise in front of you. So I don't know. I'm not going to speak. I am not a lawyer, and I'm not speaking on behalf of a lawyer, but there are certain terms that land banks put into their disposition policies. We refer to them colloquially as a clawback term, like clawback policies, which means if you don't do a certain thing, if you're going to build affordable housing, or if you're going to build for certain communities, or do certain things, or just develop, period. Because oftentimes there'll be individuals who think, I could flip this, I could hold it for a while and then make a buck in the future, or whatever. It's like, no, land banks are really looking to put it in the hands of people who are going to do work. If you don't do that, then there's certain policies. So there's ways that the property had, in some cases, they don't transfer the full property in advance, and then they don't complete the transfer and it reverts back to them. There are other places where they take out a second mortgage and they're foreclosing the second mortgage and going through some pieces. So there are a bunch of legal tools, but it accomplishes the same goal of what you're laying out there, which is the land bank has some ability to receive the property back if they don't go through what they said they were going to do. But I can tell you 100% of land banks don't want to use that tool. They want the end results there, and they really just want the tool as a way to make sure the community gets whatever it is they were requesting.
Yeah, fantastic point. That was definitely the feeling from what Gregory Good had shared about the Newark Land Bank. It's for accountability purposes having those clauses, but it's fantastic when the vision is actually achieved for the community. So that's great. Full pivot to Sid Chan's question. How do land banks deal with properties with DEP deed restrictions and or land reuse restriction plan documents filed at, I'm going to guess, Department of Environmental Protection?
Okay, I was gonna say, yeah, we are jargon heavy at Community Progress, but I don't know DEP. So that the federal EPA.
Mhm.
Okay.
Well, this one would be probably a state agency. Usually, usually like Florida Department of Environmental Protection or New Jersey.
Got it. And in some places it's a DEQ or EGLE.
Yep.
Michigan. DEP deed restrictions. You know what? That is a question I'm gonna have to punt, unfortunately. And if you could reach out to us directly, we could share you with some of our experts in house there. I can't think of any immediate examples, and Christina, I don't know if you can either of deed restrictions. So part of that pipeline I showed you when property comes to the tax foreclosure process, it usually clears out everything that was on the property before, and so that's part of the process. So I can't immediately think of any examples, but Christina, can you think of any examples where they have some sort of environmental restrictions?
We're going to have to take the Brian answer and say, love to follow up. But thank you for the question.
Yeah, and that kind of pivots us into sort of the upcoming events and things that we've got going on, where you can find both the Center for Community Progress and National Land Bank Network team, as well as NJIT TAB. But first and foremost, thank you both for lending your time and expertise to come talk to our audience about this. We'll do our best to make sure that this recording and presentation is available for folks to follow up on. And we've got a lot of things coming up where folks can find us. So really excited. Any other closing words that you wanted to have before I launch into some upcoming stuff?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you again, Mimi, for having us. Really enjoyed this talk. And I know there were a wealth of resources shared in today's chat, but if I had to emphasize one, in particular for those that are land banks on the call, I would recommend reading our progress point on land banks and brownfield redevelopment, and in particular the step-by-step guide, because it will walk you through what that process could look like for a land bank if you are looking to engage in brownfield remediation work. It'll give, like, for step one, it's saying to learn the basics. So that would mean reading some of our resources or attending the webinar. So you're already ahead of the game if you're here today. So just check that out, and let us know if you have any questions. We're always happy to help.
Amazing. Yeah, piggybacking off of that, Kaylin Bruder, our Director of Environmental Services, is on. Myself, you can reach out to our team to set up some of those community workshops. But yeah, we're so glad that folks were joining on for the webinar, like you said, getting a head start. Any parting words from you, Brian, or we'll dive in?
My last piece, I would just want to pitch, if you're interested in learning more about land banks and want to be around other folks who are doing land banking work, there's a great opportunity this fall with our National Land Bank Network Summit. It's going to be held September 8th through the 9th in Detroit, Michigan. The summit is the largest convening of land banks across the country. It's an amazing opportunity to see the diversity of the field, hear experts, and connect with others who are doing great work there. I would highly, highly recommend it. Seats are limited. It's going to be a great time for those of you who've been before. 2 years ago, we were in Cleveland. We had an amazing experience, and I think Detroit is going to be even better. So come and join us and learn even more about land banks in Detroit.
Amazing. Thank you for that. And just to kind of close out our recording side of things, Brian, Christina, thank you both for the incredibly insightful discussion. It's clear from everything that you shared that land banks are not just about the vacant land, but they're really about building stronger, healthy communities with the communities. So thank you.